Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us back. And welcome now to our panel on bias and fairness. So we know that data is used for training models, but we've seen a lot of examples where data can be unfortunately biased, and models may not properly generalize, to populations that that they're being applied on. So in this session, what we want to do is we want to discuss the the origins of bias in machine learning and data in general, right? And also, importantly, we want to talk about strategies for mitigating these biases. We have an incredible panel here. So I'll let folks introduce themselves, and let's start with Tom.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Zick. I'm currently a researcher at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law. My expertise is in thinking of regulatory interventions to help AI both grow and also avoid potential societal harms that can happen when we don't implement things responsibly. So I'm excited to be here today and join this conversation.
Amazing. Subho?
Hi, everyone. My name is Subho Majumdar. I'm right now a senior applied scientist in Splunk, specifically in the security machine learning team in Splunk. Before joining Splunk, I spent 3 years in AT&T, where I was one of the first few people who started the AI ethics team, the AI governance team over there. What I'm passionate about as a person who has background in statistics, machine learning, is operationalizing AI ethics and responsible ML principles, because I think that's a real gap in the area, and we need to all work together to come up with operational frameworks, principles, and technical tools to really build machine learning systems that are responsible, to really make all ML systems responsible. And glad to be in this panel.
Absolutely. Mark?
Thank you, Yaron, for having me. I'm Mark Nitzbergh. I am Executive Director of the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence at the University of California, Berkeley. I have a long history with artificial intelligence and was deep in the research in computer vision, and then in applications, helping vulnerable populations, working in big tech, and came back through the revolving door about 6 years ago to work with Stuart Russell on these issues. So it's something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, and I think it's terrific that it's shifting from hand wringing to organizations actually turning it into law, and people like Yaron making companies to help out with these issues.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it, and I well remember Stuart from my days at Berkeley as well. So it's amazing that you guys are working together on this. Super happy. And Ravit, can you maybe a brief introduction?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm going to use your introduction, Mark, because I also have a Berkeley background. So yeah, I was at Berkeley. That's where I did my PhD in philosophy. So that is my background. And now I'm focusing on how we take AI ethics and move it from talk to action. So what you said, Subho, about operationalization, yeah, really resonated with me. And so in that context of this question, how do we move AI ethics from talk to action, from companies putting principles on their website to actually doing things? I work in 3 sectors. So I work in the academic sector still, and I'm founding a lab focused on this at the University of Pittsburgh. At the same time, my background here, I'm VP of Responsible AI at a company called the AI Responsibility Lab. And I have some other smaller things. But yeah, that is who I am.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for introducing yourselves. I want to start off with just very broadly, to start off the conversation by talking about basically what are thinking about the stakes and the challenges when we have bias in AI, right? And specifically what do you guys think are the major stakes and challenges when it comes to bias in AI? And why do you think that? What are the things that can cause doubts in public trust when it comes to artificial intelligence systems?
I think we're all being too polite here.
Okay, yeah. So Mark,
you might need to call on someone, and I'm
all right. Yeah. So Mark, please.
I will just say that the way I look at it is that AI is really like a sort of turbo amplifier, right? And so it's allowing us to automate, and when we automate, we risk baking in whatever we essentially feed the machine. And therefore we're going to be amplifying our processes and procedures, and that includes the bad with the good. And so our biases are being captured and baked in and amplified by these systems, and that it's just that the stakes increase with this amplification.
So Mark, it sounds like you're saying that you feel like there's basically kind of biases are baked into human judgment, and then kind of like the data reflects that, and then when we take that to AI, it sort of scales. Is that a correct? Like, am I
paraphrasing? Better phrasing it. Yes, thank you.
No, I mean that makes a lot of sense. Like, Tom, I know you've been thinking about this. So, like, what do you think are kind of like the biggest kind of stakes and challenges when it comes to bias in AI?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Mark, which is maybe not surprising because I was also at Berkeley and worked very closely with one of Mark's students. But I think scale is one aspect of this that's really problematic. I also think ubiquity. I think just the cross-sector nature of AI and how it can fit into existing processes, and very much delegate agency away from people and making these decisions. Whereas if you're kind of originally people were thinking, well, algorithms, that's a good way to avoid bias. Like we look at a rubric, we're evaluating people against that. And so we're not letting our personal judgment get in the way. And there's very much an equivocation between that and automating systems. And I think that is something that is problematic and surprisingly hard to avoid when you're implementing AI systems.
Yeah, I agree. That makes a lot of sense. Subho, what you have a take on this? Seems like you're in agreement.
Yeah, for sure. Specifically, I think both Mark and Tom, what you said makes a lot of resonance to what my thoughts are, which are specifically around the fact that when we are talking about AI, we are talking about automated decision making, and that's essentially scaling up the human level decision making that is behind the products and services of the companies that are deploying AI to a mass scale that can serve millions or even billions of customers. And while doing that, what we want to do, in a sense, when talking about responsible AI or AI ethics, is how to scale those human level ethical considerations to that machine level decision. Now, of course, it's easier said than done. And that's why we are having this broad discussion as a community, that what aspects of human decision making can we bake into these AI systems and how. And I think that goes back to the fact that as humans, we are not perfect. We often have our own personal and collective biases that often unintentionally get baked into those AI systems, and because of which these fairness concerns arise. And I think that's like the core motivation of how bias issues in AI occur, and why we should mitigate this. The reason we should mitigate this is we want the carryover of the basic ethical principles, basic human values that we operate in as a society into these machine learning systems, which are used for autonomous decision making at scale.
So I think it's really interesting, like talking about scale. Like I think that's such a huge aspect of it. Like kind of like it's now there are, when we're thinking that there are inherent like kind of biases in human judgment that go into like kind of collecting data, and now we're applying them at scale. I'm curious, like Mark and Subho, from a technical perspective, right? you guys probably have a good insight on this, and in this, like as I do, on I think that there's another issue about, I think it's sort of like all relates to expectation management, right? I think that we know when we know like kind of behind the scenes, like how kind of how AI is built, right, and kind of like what makes it work, and sort of like the ultimately like we're talking about like like a decision boundary, right? Whether it's a hyperplane or some sort of like manifold, but at the end of the day, it's a decision boundary, right? It's not it's a very limited form of intelligence, right? So I think there's also a big part of it is when we're thinking about some of the challenges is like kind of expectation management on what AI can or cannot do, right? Which sort of creates some of the issues with bias and fairness. Is that something that from the looking at behind the scenes, the technical behind the scenes, do you see as well, or is this or do you feel like kind of scale is the kind of like the major issue?
Oh, I do think expectation management is a big part. And I think there are two aspects of this, technical and non-technical expectation management. So expectation management from product and executive side, so sort of the top-down version, top-down expectations, and the bottom-up expectation that what can we, in the best case scenario, expect from the data using a machine learning model? What insights can we extract? So I specifically call out 2 points. Firstly, one on the top-down part, one on the bottom-up part. Let me start with the bottom-up part. The bottom-up part is, of course, data. I'm trained as a statistician. So as statisticians, we are trained to think about data as not being ground truth. It is a version of ground truth, data being collected from a population as a sample of the population. So in that sampling process, there could be biases inherent, which would then propagate to the outcomes of the model, whatever rigorous modeling approach you use. If the data is bad, the model is going to be bad and is going to disparately impact certain parts of the population. So because of that reason, it's useful to give a lot of conscious effort towards the design process of machine learning models, specifically focused on the data collection, quality checking, and vetting process. And so that's, in a nutshell, that's my thought on the data part. And also on the top-down part, I think there is often a disconnect between like expectations of what the data team is supposed to be doing and from the business perspective, and what the data team is supposed to be doing for the ethics, from the ethics and responsible AI perspective. And I think that's often a misnomer, in the sense that these optimization problems on large scale data that we're dealing with, these are often not if and else conditions in terms of optimizing for both model performance and bias. So in those situations, I think that is a communication gap, I would say, often that arises in a industry setting, which is not really there. And we need to make conscious efforts in bridging that gap. We can, of course, talk more about the details later on, but I'll stop there for Mark's and others' thoughts.
And Mark, do you share that opinion as well? More generally about, or kind of like about yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's just that there's so much to do. So yes, we need to bring up, and I think we have brought up the level of understanding about what AI can do, and at the same time, we see a breakthrough, and then we see what look like breakthroughs coming out, because that breakthrough has now found new applications in different sectors. So the idea of a deep neural network in a sort of simplest form sort of solved computer vision, recognizing objects that come in through a camera, right, and into a computer's memory. But then with some variations, it's then used to solve to make leaps in performance of other systems that apply to different sectors. So object recognition was used in at Amazon for identifying products, and in medicine right, for diagnosis, and they're very different stakes, right? If you get the wrong product at Amazon, it's making a recommendation for the wrong product. If you get, the wrong portion of a lung as the portion to remove in a surgery, that's got really high stakes, and so you need to apply different standards based on the application area, and that's something that I think we keep coming back to, that we need to be developing standards sector by sector.
So when we think about like kind of these high stakes like cases, then we've seen kind of some also pretty public failures of models, right? And that's been in the press, certainly in the past year. How concerned are you guys about models that are actually they're running in production? Do you feel like it's do you feel like these are isolated cases, or do you feel like this is sort of like the tip of the iceberg and we're going to see a lot more? And I'm curious, Ravit, like what
actually I want to add something to the previous question, if that's okay, before we move on. So the question of some root causes of bias that we're seeing, and I agree 100% that one of the biggest problems that we're having is a garbage in, garbage out situation. I think there's a few additional things to think about, so I just want to highlight one of them. I think there's a way to think of bias as if it's something we can. There's like an easy way to eliminate. So we kind of like we go into the data set, we know exactly what we want the baseline to be, and then we're just like, bam, we fixed it. Now it's gone. And I think that's a natural way to see things. But I think describing it that way hides some very important decisions that we make along the way, and they are value decisions. Here's an analogy that I've heard of. It's not mine, but I don't remember who made it. But apparently,
do you mean that there needs to be like transparency in the process that we have?
I'll use this analogy, and then I hope it will help explain what I mean. So when you draw crowds on cartoons, apparently on average 80% of those crowds are men. Like the people in like the drawn up audiences are men. Just a question why. Just a question of whether it's okay. And someone can, and I've heard people say this, something like that. Well, if in reality, 80% of people who go to football games are men, should I or should I not draw this audience differently? You see what I mean? So when we make decisions about what kind of representation we want in our data set, in a way, it is a value decision. Do we want it to represent the world as it is, or do we want it to represent the world as we want it to be? And if so, how do we want the world to be? What kind of populations should be represented in our data set, and to what extent? And so these are decisions that we must make when we address our databases. And these are difficult value choices that are kind of hidden in a way. But I think they're crucial when we're thinking about bias. So to me, a part of the question is a value question, and not that is kind of embedded, hidden in the technical question.
So maybe like like for a machine learning engineer, what I would say is like say it's fine to like introduce sampling biases like into your process of training a model, but like you want to have some sort of like documentation, or you want to have some sort of like like transparency around the evidence, like kind of some transparency, right, around the process that you've used, right, for that sampling bias, right? And maybe like initially in models there's been no kind of like the sampling biases have all been kind of like focused on performance, right? And now we kind of at least sounds like we can make a good first step into kind of documenting or just kind of like exposing kind of like some of our sampling biases when for mitigating biases.
Yeah, and I would go even a step further. Transparency, I think, is really important, but also accountability. So these decisions need to come into light and given the proper weight. And I've seen how in practice sometimes it's the most junior person who's been given the task, and now they're just going to make a judgment call. No one else is going to be a part of it. But in fact, that judgment call is going to be really important. Yeah, how many women do you want? And so I think it is important to make those questions very central and have different stakeholders in the organization chiming in, and maybe have a process to make this decision, and then have the transparency too. So transparency along with very responsible governance around how you make those decisions.
And I just resonate with that so much that I would love to jump in if that's okay. That's
all right.
Great. And I think it's really important from an operational perspective. We do have documentation that can be used internally, can have external facing components, but making sure that that documentation is accessible to multiple stakeholders who can bring out those value questions that might not occur to the person who's making the decision. So it's a combination of transparency and accessibility almost to make that actually operationally useful. And I think that becomes even more important in the context of machine learning systems that are going to be retrained and might actually change the environment that they're operating in. Like, for example, if we think of financial tech, who gets a loan, those decisions have the first level of they can be biased on who gets a loan, but they can also have feedback problems of, well, if who got denied a loan then cannot get one, or someone who was given one but should not have gotten one then has worse credit. There are all these feedback effects that, again, have to be monitored to make sure that even if you don't have if everyone agrees that your system is okay at face level, it could still have ramifications on the feedback end that are problematic, which makes it even more important to document and articulate and make sure everything is accessible.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and especially when when we're thinking about kind of like the set of all things that like there are a lot of like challenges that come with AI, a lot of like technological barriers, there are a lot of issues, but but documentation on on the ways that models have been trained is not like technologically it's just not that difficult, right? And it's something that we see a great need for, and something that is is not hard to provide data scientists. So in that vein, like Subho, I'm wondering like when like for data science teams, right, and people who are leading and working with data science teams like within companies, like I'm curious, like how does in your at Splunk or or other organizations that you've been at AT&T, like how does the organization think about bias and fairness in the data science pipeline?
So short answer is that we are still figuring it out. Long answer is that it's
that's the most common answer, by the way.
Yeah. So long answer is that, and in here I go back to one of my main motivations of being in this field, is that we need to build bridges. We need to build bridges between the expertise that is there in the different product teams, in the different legal and compliance teams, between them, between the motivation essentially behind why we need machine learning models to be unbiased, fair, explainable, robust, essentially the whole gamut of responsible AI. That motivation can be company values, that motivation can be regulations, that motivations can be best practices or compliance guidelines. But we need to be able to translate those guidelines to technical metrics, measure those metrics, and then finally mitigate those metrics, or at the very least, bring those metrics down to acceptable levels and document in an accountable and transparent way, so that future machine learning teams, future teams that are working on similar projects or projects in the same domain, or maybe better versions of the same model, can learn from that. Because from an industry perspective, it's all about efficiency, right? That you want not only the machine learning models to be scalable, be able to predict for millions or billions of customers in a scalable manner, but we want the whole practice to be scalable, whole data science practices to be scalable, like data to be reusable, model components to be reusable. And in that situation, I think the biggest need, and which I've tried to tackle in AT&T while building out the AI governance practice over there, is to build that top level documentation and monitoring platform that picks out salient information from machine learning pipelines and picks out salient information from the SME expertise, essentially, puts them all together in a essentially directed acyclic graph kind of structure that represents an abstracted view of the machine learning pipeline and persists that information as a structured document that gives like a top level summary of what the hell happened with this machine learning model that is in production for future teams to kind of query and learn from on demand. And I think that process was very much enlightening, specifically to learn about the hurdles, that it is not an easy task. And that's why I think we as an industry are still figuring out how to best manage that, how to best approach that, and also integrate along with these MLOps frameworks or MLOps architectures that are coming up to manage machine learning models in scale and manage their development in scale. How can we work together in lockstep to achieve that level of scale, transparency, and accountability?
So like let me ask about the flip side of ML at scale and then the platforms, and that's the human in the loop aspect. So in the previous previous panel, we had a panel on ML integrity and insurance, right? And we've heard from Anuj about basically the concept, like for them, they think about human in the loop as, kind of like an exponential underwriter, right? Thinking about like, putting human in the loop and having them use AI, to sort of like, exponentially like kind of their, productivity. So Tom, Ravit, I know that both of you, come from like a legal background and Ravit, like, from a, like philosophy and ethics background. I'm curious, like, how do you think about, about human in the loop, right? And when it comes to mitigating like bias in ML, is that do you think that that's the solution and that's the way forward?
I can go ahead and jump in real quick. I think that if we can figure out how to do it well, it can be great. I'm actually going to answer a bit more from the technical perspective on this. Generally, studies of people using machine learning in their decision making show that people are great at either completely ignoring the system and doing whatever they would anyways, or completely listening to the system, turning off their brains and just following those recommendations. And the startling thing is that that's true even when it's just one of a few factors. And so
basically the risk of like having human in the loop is that we have no humans in the loop at all.
We have no engaged humans in the loop.
Right.
And I think that's really the differentiator. We need to figure out a way to make people to engage with the information that they are there to safeguard, and the decisions they are there to validate. And how that looks like, I think, is not settled and highly non-trivial. So I'm curious what everyone else thinks of that as well.
Ravit, from like an ethics perspective, do humans have like a higher moral compass that can guide ML systems, or?
Okay, so I don't know about that, but I do know that people are also biased. People have a lot of biases. And in fact, one of the advantages that people highlight for AI systems is that they can eliminate certain kinds of biases if used properly. I remember, this research about judges making less favorable decisions before lunch or something when they're hungry. Not great. Machines are not hungry. But so it's kind of, so for me, it's, I'm of two minds. Because if we do use the algorithms properly, they can actually help us mitigate some of the biases. So I think, I'm frozen, or is it? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I think, so I'm not sure. I think I'm really in agreement with Tom that it would really depend how we integrate those automated decisions. And I heard this really interesting flip. Instead of thinking of humans in the loop, we should be thinking about machines in the loop. And what is the right way to include them in the loop.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's maybe for a lot of systems, that's a better way of thinking about it, right? And I think so, and that's that's kind of like I think kind of like a big component when it comes to like these critical decisions, right? It's like, how are these decisions end up getting made? I guess one thing that like that I want to if I think about like kind of less from the decision making part, but more from like the model training part, the prevention part, right? I'm curious, like if we let's talk about like a more of a technical problem, right? So Mark, like when a lot of times that we talk to like to technical people, like what we hear is that they want to make they want to make their models more performant, they want to make their models more less biased. The problem that they're facing is they just don't have a lot of data, right, for certain subgroups of kind of in populations, right? What what advice can we give data science organization, data scientists that have the best intentions in mind, but they just don't really just don't have data on the different subgroups to like train the model properly?
Well, there's an analogy to financial systems. When you have a financial system that's operating with a big model called a risk model, and it has an understanding of the behavior of every company, and then a new company comes on the scene, right? Something goes public or there's a spin-off. There's no data about that company. And so there is a process where someone manually researches the company. What sector is it in? What is it doing? How big is it? How is it likely to behave? And then creates this profile for it from nothing. And so there's a way in which we can do this with data-driven systems, which is to take we have a little bit of data, but we have an understanding of the characteristics of, say, a particular underrepresented population, and then we use those characteristics and to the best of our ability create data. So that's one solution, is synthesize data, and synthetic data is used effectively for training systems, autonomous systems in the world of self-driving cars and in fact some pretty high stakes drones and so forth. And they're trained on synthetic data, and then you put them in the real world and they operate safely. And so I think that's a direction to go. There's also a body of work by, I think, Professor Michael Kearns at the University of Pennsylvania, where they really take it to brass tacks. So what do we mean by fair? If what we mean is that there is a proportional representation, of different populations, and that we treat those proportional representations to the degree possible equally or in proportion, then we should, by the definition of justice, which is, fair distribution of burdens and benefits, make sure that the failures of the system that occur approximately with proportional representation. So if we're going to fail on Aboriginal faces in terms of recognition, it should fail as many times as there are in proportion to that population in the overall population. And then you can start to do something about assuring fairness and making proofs and statements about it, because then you've defined it well enough to actually write programs about it.
So it sounds like we need kind of like concrete definitions, and so we can actually create benchmarks for for training models, and then from a technical perspective, we should do synthetic data. And Mark, I'm also hearing like things that you kind of sounds like you're saying things that we should think maybe a little bit about this like a little bit as a cold start problem. Maybe like there are subpopulations that we don't have data for, we should think about this as a cold start problem. Maybe we should leverage some, tools from like transfer learning, right? Like, from everything we know about one population, so, use kind of that as a starting point for like, training on a new population. So sounds like these are kind of like some things that people could use.
I want to add to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I really like what you just said, Mark. And to me, it's related to a thing that I mentioned before. Those value decisions, those difficult choices that are built into our attempts, to make algorithms more fair. So, unfortunately for us, there are many, with this philosophy background that I have, so many definitions of what counts as fair, and so many ethical perspectives. And the reality is, yeah, there are different approaches, and those approaches may be related to different political opinions that we might have. And this is not a bug. This is a feature. And I think that, to me, the consequence is that I don't think that we will ever have a universal, quote unquote, objective neutral definition of fairness, of bias, or anything else. And instead, each company that designs AI systems, or that designs, a vendor that designs solutions, they would have to make those difficult choices of what is the right fit for this context, for this value system. And I think it's a part of the complexity that we're facing, and a part of the challenge when it comes to bias, that we would need to think carefully about what we do in each and every case. And we are going to have disagreements, just like we have political disagreements. In a way, it is a political disagreement.
So actually, I'm curious, like, when we're thinking about, like, disagreements about standards, I'm curious, like, more broadly, right? Like, we're talking about like how, like, AI standards and AI ethics. Like, I'm curious to hear from all of you. How do you think like, with everything that we're seeing with AI, right? And like, how do you think that like AI is going to shape our human values, right? So we're talking about like, we're talking about technical standards, right? And kind of like technical standards and technical values, right, for what is fair and what is not fair. But in general, like, I'm curious, like, how do you think like AI is reshaping human values, and whether it's like, reshaping power around the world?
I can go first. I have many opinions on this question.
All right, definitely you should go.
Okay. I'll start with what you said last, how AI is going to shape power dynamics in the world. And I think it's too soon to tell, in a way, but also there are some concerning trends that I think it's important to pay attention to. In this field called AI ethics, here's the thing that is happening. A lot of principles and standards, hundreds of them, the vast majority, is coming from the US and Europe, and also from men. This is, just like a fact. We're starting to see, this is a sentence people say. People say, we're starting to see convergence, but I'm asking, is it convergence, or is it an echo chamber of people talking to one another, especially when I read this really interesting.
Are there like kind of examples where you?
Yeah. I was just going to give an example.
Okay, love to hear.
I read this really great study about some of the principles in AI ethics. They come from bioethics, for example, autonomy. And apparently in bioethics, there is this disagreement about autonomy, because the Western interpretation of autonomy is individualistic, but it has been found that it's conflicting with communitarian values in African communities. And so it's actually a bad fit for those communities, to the extent that the World Health Organization has different consent procedures for medical experimentations in those countries. And so if we just take those same values from those same principles from bioethics, which, some researchers like Flaherty suggest, we might just like continue the same mistakes of the past. And so we should expect divergence in principles in different parts of the world, but I'm not seeing it being taken into account as much. And so there's a risk of some kind of, ethical colonialization if we don't watch ourselves. And that is a thing that can and does, change the power dynamics in the world.
And then how do the, like, yeah, Mark, sounds like you want to say.
I just, where do I start? As Tom said, it's really about the scale and ubiquity of these systems, right? They're half the world, wakes up in the morning, and what it thinks about in the morning is determined by an algorithm that is a recommender system, right? That decides which article will come up to the top on whatever it is that they're reading on their phone, right? And it's not just in the morning; it's maybe 100 times a day, depending on the society there. And so, because of this scale and ubiquity, I think there is an awesome influential power in the hands of these very few companies, and that is something that we're grappling with, and something that I think Europe is eager to do something about, with its new laws. They come from a place of protecting, consumers, and they also come from a place of competition policy. But really, what it comes down to is that there's just this awesome influential power, and it's for sale, but it really goes through these companies. So I just wanted to bring that up in terms of reshaping, the landscape of power around the world, right at the highest level, at the individual level. The idea of our values and what we think is right and wrong can in fact be changed by campaigns that are using this awesome power, right? So there's a lot, right, just in that direction.
So it sounds like, Mark, what we're thinking is generally that we shouldn't think about it's it's probably a little bit different from kind of technical standards, right? That we have, right? Because they're largely influenced by and also kind of going back to what Ravit said, right? It's all largely influenced by the geographic regions, right, where that are kind of in control in defining these standards, right? And also the fact that these standards are fluid, like they can they can our standards can change, like what is maybe acceptable to us now 20 years from now may no longer be acceptable, right? I think this is I think this is just like a huge and very kind of interesting topic. I know there's there's a lot more that we can cover here, but unfortunately our time is up. I want to thank our panelists one more time, and hope to connect with all of you individually later on, in the coming months. Thank you all for participating.